Hello, my name is Dave Emery, and this is Side 1 of For the Record program number 730, Interview with Russ Baker. This program is being recorded on December 3rd of the year 2010. Once again, it's my pleasure and privilege to bring back to our airwaves Russ Baker, the author of the consummately important book Family of Secrets, which removes the cover from much of the Bush family's operations of really the better part of a century. Russ, welcome back to our airwaves.
Thank you very much, Dave. Good to be here.
Well, back in May and June, we recorded 6 one-hour interviews about Family of Secrets, and I think we did a good job of synopsizing. It might seem like a silly word to use for 6 hours of broadcasting, but given the formidable, deep amount of information in Family of Secrets, I think that's really all we did was to give a good overview of the book. There's an awful lot there to discuss. In the time since then, I'd be interested to get your reaction about the book itself as a phenomenon. Any thoughts in that regard? One of the things that struck me, and one of the reasons that particular question comes to mind, is the fact that, for example, you talk about the Kennedy assassination and tie the elder George Bush and a number of other political figures, mainstream political figures, into that event. Students of the event know that, but your book discusses that, and yet it has gotten acceptance in circles that normally look askance at any discussion of topics that are deemed to be conspiracy theory. And it's one of the things I find remarkable about the book itself. Any thoughts about the book and it as a political event in and of itself?
Well, none of it has been easy. It wasn't easy to get a publisher to commit to it. Several of them, of the bigger houses, expressed excitement about the material, but some small sense, at least, of terror of actually publishing it. So we were lucky to get a good publisher, and then we did experience a kind of a blackout when it first came out. We were told that I would be on all kinds of major network programs, television, radio, and excerpts in major magazines and so on. And then one after another, those windows closed. And so, but you're right. We have managed a certain amount of mainstream acceptance, and I think that's probably due to a combination of reasons. One is that I've been laboring as a professional journalist for quite a few years, and have developed, I guess, some reputation as well as relationships with people in the business who are perhaps more mainstream than I am. I've also been published over the years in many name brand publications and electronic media. And so I think that was a factor. Also, just I try to be very, very careful in the way that I do my work. And so most everything in Family of Secrets is footnoted. I tried always to include to name the sources and so forth. And so I think that helped. And then I think some of the endorsements are more kind of generalized endorsements of the body of work and larger than just the book, but my work over the years. And this maybe gives some people who've endorsed Family of Secrets or my work a bit of cover, you might say. In other words, this allows them to generally support this work, even though they themselves don't go this far in their own programs, their own articles, and so forth. And then we did have a few nice reviews from print publications. And then, as I say, more and more as this keeps happening, people become increasingly comfortable. And, we put out this recently, this terrific video. You can watch it on our website, familyofsecrets.com, or if you go on YouTube, we've set up a YouTube channel. You type in www.youtube.com/Family of Secrets, all together with no spaces, Family of Secrets. And then you go to that page and automatically it opens with this video, which has all these blurbs from people like Sidney Schanberg, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his work on the killing fields of Cambodia, David Margolick, who was the New York Times legal affairs correspondent and then later with Vanity Fair and now Newsweek, and people like that. And so I think as people see those names and those affiliations, it gives them a sense that, this stuff it may be solid, and it's interesting, as you say, that we're sort of crossing that line that may not be crossed. That's one of my main missions, by the way, Dave, with my work in Family of Secrets, but also with our nonprofit investigative website, whowhatwhy.com, whowhatwhy.com, where we're trying to do work with the same standards of agnosticism and open-mindedness and balance that the mainstream media at least claims to attempt. And so I think we stand apart from a lot of the things, a lot of the efforts that go into these areas that you see particularly on the Internet, where people don't even make there's not even any pretense of trying to really get to the bottom of things, but rather there seem to be agendas in play.
One of the things that was really striking to me about Family of Secrets, and that is in developing this same theme, in addition to approaching a number of topics, especially the assassination of President Kennedy, which are normally viewed as off-limits, and the people who dare to cross into that territory are simply viewed as untouchables, in effect, as creatures who were simply unacceptable, and I use the term creatures advisedly, and yet you did cross into that territory. Another thing that I think was significant about the book, and that is that you broach the issue of, well, throughout Family of Secrets, the Bush family, both generations, not only, well, really more than two, but the Bush family are seen as deeply involved with the intelligence community, and just about everything they do is inextricably linked with intelligence operations. You also have taken that and explored its logical conclusion in something that's become an ongoing reality, and that is the use of covert operation, the use of intelligence methodology to control political process here in the United States. Any thoughts on that as we look back on the recent midterm elections?
Yes, I mean, I think it has gradually dawned on me in the 2 decades plus that I've done journalism, the extent to which so much of the system that we take for granted was actually rigged right from the beginning against the majority. And, back in the early 90s when I did investigative cover stories for the Village Voice, I was already starting to find that as I looked at things like disaster relief nonprofits that turned out to be something else, run by George H.W. Bush's college roommate, and it turned out that seemed to have some connections to Iran-Contra and maybe weapons running, all sorts of other things. And so I said, so all of these institutions that we take for granted, that we're told, you can give your money here if you want to help out in the case of the earthquake in this country and the flood in that one and so forth. And so that already back then I was seeing that, but my eyes were really opened in the 5 years I spent researching Family of Secrets to a whole other degree of this, and that was, as you say, the domestic side. And as I began tracing all of these individuals, many of whom, some of whom you've heard of, many of whom you haven't. And that's one of the reasons I think Family of Secrets is both a challenging and a sort of invigorating read, is because of all of these characters that are brought in that are new. And I had to do that because you actually can see these operations taking place. You can see the control of these institutions coming into play. And so, for example, the relationship between Prescott Bush and a man named Robert Lovett, his business partner, and then Robert Lovett being probably the principal person responsible for the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, and then going back and looking at the banking firm that they were partners in and seeing how this firm, working with the law firms of Alan Dulles and his brother and other outfits, were able to influence many American administrations back to the beginning of the 20th century to intervene in foreign countries on behalf of these private holdings. And so I began to see that these very institutions that we just take for granted, CIA, NSA, FBI, Department of Homeland Security, that we don't actually think about, well, what are these things? Where did they come from? Whose idea was it? And so on. And that, I think, just really sort of takes you, as you say, over a line, and you're in whole new territory.
One of the points that I made in particularly the first couple of interviews that we did, and it's one of the areas that I think you're one of the many strengths of the book, and that is that it illustrates one of the realities, I believe the dominant reality of certainly American power structure. One could perhaps argue that's true and has always been true around the world, but whenever the subject of something like the assassination of President Kennedy comes up, X number of people are automatically going to roll their eyes and go, "Oh, I don't believe in conspiracy theories," and that type of subject matter is dismissed very quickly and effectively as conspiracy theory. It means that it's silly. We don't have to look at it, and yet. What your book does is to illustrate networking, and that really what is demeaned as conspiracy theory and what is dismissed as an insignificant trifle really is an outgrowth of what could be, I think, said to be the main manifestation of power and economic largesse in any society, particularly this one. And that's how they work. And it's one of the real strengths, I think, of the book is the way you start with going back to Prescott, Leavitt, and the robber barons of the Gilded Age, and then following the evolution of family power and corporate power through the decades.
Right. When I began the work on Family of Secrets, I really had not intended nor expected to get into any of that. I started with very simple questions. I was sort of interested in knowing more about George W. Bush and how someone as improbable as he would rise to that level and then do the very controversial things that he did. So I didn't know where this would lead, and so it was very interesting to just keep assembling dots and then beginning to connect them, and to see this sort of American oligarchy at work. And to realize that, of course, why didn't I think of this before? That the same people who very openly have championed interventions all over the world against democracies, and have felt that we had the right of empire, essentially, that those attitudes would not suddenly be abandoned when they returned home, and that in fact the stakes are much higher here. So the very same types of attitudes and approaches would be operative, except that they'd have to go to much greater lengths to make it not obvious that they were doing this. They obviously could not do it openly in this country. And in fact, in the other countries, of course, like in Guatemala with the invasion there in the 50s, they had these elaborate covers in Chile in the 70s. And so they were always using surrogates and so forth and propaganda through second parties. And so they're never really out in the open about this. And in the United States, they certainly haven't been out in the open, but we can begin to see these things. And they do manifest themselves visibly in the persons of individuals like Karl Rove, or Dick Cheney, where they essentially choose to kind of emerge from the shadows and sort of take the rap for a lot of things that are deemed disturbing, dangerous, or illegal. And in fact, it's very interesting because by them being willing to take the rap, they then take that kind of criticism from the mainstream media, the corporate-owned media, and so you'll see columnists in the New York Times ferociously going after both Rove and Cheney, but failing to understand, or maybe they understand but they don't talk about the fact that these men are just working for others, and that they are laboring on behalf of this very elaborate system of power that has probably always been with us. One of the chapters or events that you describe in your book that really illustrates how, in a sense, the chickens came home to roost on November 22nd, 1963. That is Barbara Bush's letter that you dissect and point out how it really is something of a deliberate cover for what the Bush family were doing on November 22nd, 1963. Forgotten the name of the gentleman, but he had helped with covert operations in Greece, among other places, and he was a long-standing covert actions specialist, CIA, and he had stopped by Dallas, Texas, right about the time President Kennedy was being killed, and you place him and the elder George Bush with an milieu of covert action specialists. I've forgotten the guy's name offhand, but he was... Alfred Ulmer.
There we go, yes.
Yeah, Al Ulmer. See, and it's very interesting because Larry King had George H.W. and Barbara Bush on recently, and he didn't ask them, not surprisingly, anything tough. I actually am just writing a blog post for our site, whowhatwhy.com, about, I read in the New York Times yesterday or the day before an article, Dateline Moscow, about these WikiLeaks, the diplomatic cables referencing Vladimir Putin in a negative light, and the New York Times article then says, to deal with these, Vladimir Putin went on to Larry King, where the King is notorious for his they actually said his softball questioning, and so he knew he could get on there and make his case without being challenged. And we actually went back and did some research, myself and Dave McHenry, who helps us with some of our stuff, and we're unable to find any other examples of the New York Times ever referencing Larry King's softball style with former President Bush 41 and so forth. And that's really where they ought to be focusing, that here's Family of Secrets with 4 chapters of new information on the Kennedy assassination, all coming out of curiosity about George H.W. Bush's statement he couldn't remember where he was on November 22, 1963. And then all of these facts, which we can go into, the CIA's overthrow expert who lives abroad in 1963, coming to visit just by chance the week of November 22 and having lunch with the Bushes and so forth. And, all of these things. And
this the aforementioned Al Ulmer.
Al Ulmer,
yeah.
Right. And so, this, of course, you would want Larry King in the New York Times to ask Bush 41, just out of curiosity. This man has this book. He's a well-known journalist, and it's all footnoted. And just curious, what's your reaction? Where were you on November 22? How did you know Al Ulmer? You were a small-time oil man. How did you know Al Ulmer, CIA coup expert extraordinaire? But nobody asks.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the thing to do, I think, if you really want to get mainstream America to at least contemplate some of the questions that you raise in Family of Secrets, you're going to have to go on Dancing with the Stars, Russ. I think
I'm thinking about that. I've got an inquiry into the Palin family to see if we can do some sort of a duet of sorts.
Yeah, it actually brings to mind, obviously, I'm kidding to an extent. Actually, I'm kidding, period. But it brings to mind one of my favorite quotes from author Edith Wharton, who noted that, quote, "A frivolous society can only achieve dramatic significance through what its frivolity destroys." And that is something, although obviously Sarah Palin is rightfully the subject of a great deal of mirth, the fact that she could become the serious political phenomenon she has become is not funny at all. That isn't in the least little bit amusing. It is, in a sense, when you undertook to write Family of Secrets, I take it as a given that there was an element of confusion about how does somebody like George W. Bush, who clearly was not qualified to be president of the United States and who basically played true, he botched his presidency, how does he become president immediately after his failed presidency and after the complete failure of free market economics, yet that same ideology is once again coming to the fore, and it should, I think, cause people to ask questions. It's past a point mystifying.
I think that we are failed in the question-asking department on almost everything. I'd love to have the time to look more into Sarah Palin and whether this is just simply, another pretty face, because we know that she doesn't bring a lot of insight into the world or policy vision or anything else. She's not a tremendously good speaker or debater or what have you. And so what is that we're looking at other than her physical looks? I don't see such a great job being done of that by the media. So I would say almost anything you want to talk about, Homeland Security, what is it? What's the real value of these gropings and full body scans and so on. I just was listening to the radio up here in the Bay Area the other day, and somebody was talking about at-risk youth, and how by not funding programs for them, we actually increase the danger to ourselves so vastly much more than we ever face a danger from foreign terrorists. So there's no kind of thoughtful balancing out of risks. Nobody's really looking into these things.
Bill Clinton recently observed that we're in a, quote, fact-free, unquote, political environment, which I would suggest that that's been true for a long time. And I think one of the things that Family of Secrets does is to go back and to haul a great deal of subject material into the investigative spotlight that generally has been dismissed, as I've indicated, as, oh, that's silly conspiracy theory, who cares about that? One of the things that you point out in Family of Secrets is the way that the power structure you're looking at has enabled itself through generations. In other words, the elder George Bush got a lot of impetus from people around him, from his ancestors and from the institutions that caused them to thrive. He then obviously helped George W. Bush to prosper and set the stage for his rise to power. And that generational manifestation is one of the things that obviously has brought us to the situation we're in. Talking about the lack of commentary, you mentioned that Politico.com is actually done by the son of a major George W. Bush supporter. Which guy was that?
Joe Albritton. He had been involved with, I want to say, was it Riggs Bank? It was one of these banks in Washington that was involved with Saudi money, and there were investigations of it, and I believe some consequences. And the son is running it, and the son, you can't necessarily hold the children responsible for what their parents do. But it's interesting that so many, the old media was the Washington Post, controlled by the Graham family, with their and the Meyer family before that, their ties into the military and the spy establishment and the banks and so forth, and then they are sort of unseated to some extent by Politico, and here's another guy who's another banker who's again connected in with the exact same interests. And I say that, I was delighted to actually write something recently for Politico, a fairly narrow piece that did not go into 90-some% of the revelations of Family Secrets, but nevertheless they let me at least talk about George W. Bush and his book and say some other things. And I think there's some good people working there, but you're pointing out just this issue of ownership and control, and I think that is an important one to study.
I know when I hear, for example, during my morning commute, I'm listening to the radio and I'm listening to the traffic reports, and the CBS AM news affiliate here features regular input from Politico, and so in terms of as they're presenting what for the most part is critical observations about Barack Obama, it's just interesting that it's coming from someone who is the son of a major Bush supporter. Riggs Bank also, I would note, was a major repository for funds used for covert operations over the decades.
Well, that's right.
Yet another institution that's inextricably linked with the intelligence milieu and the world of covert operations we've been discussing.
Yeah, and as I recall, I may be wrong on this, but as I recall, the elder Albritton comes out of Texas. So, again, he's very much part of that circle.
And what you referred to, or what you quote somebody as referring to, the Texas Raj, figures prominently in the book, the power elite of Texas, and they are powerful, and they are something of an elite. Although one could perhaps argue that it's strictly in an economic sense, and that they represent some of the dregs of society as a whole. Have you had any response to some of the investigations in the book? And has anybody suggested that some of the material be used to reopen or carry on any investigations?
I think it's too early for that. We're still in those beginning stages of trying to simply let people know that Family of Secrets exists. And that's difficult enough. There are, I don't know the numbers, but there are tens or hundreds of thousands of books published in the English language each year. And then so many more that are sitting there in places like Amazon. And so to kind of break out of that and create any awareness is very, very difficult. I'm on a kind of a really extended campaign or tour to let people know about Family of Secrets, because even people who are deeply interested in the very topics we're discussing about don't even know generally that it exists. And so I found, for example, with people on Capitol Hill that they've told me we don't have time to read books. But it sounds interesting. People who work in the White House who really ought to know about these things and may not even realize what they got themselves into, that they need to read it. And so it's starting to happen that people are, adopting Family of Secrets and buying half a dozen or a dozen copies and sending them to people they know in the White House, on Capitol Hill, in news organizations, or to people they don't know, which, by the way, I'd love to see more folks get copies and just send them to opinion makers and let them know about it. And I'm guessing that most of the people who would mount these investigations, people on the Hill, advocates in various areas, whether it's the Kennedy assassination or people who want to get to the bottom of what Watergate really was, people who scrutinize the activities of the intelligence apparatus, I would still say that the vast majority of them have not read Family of Secrets or even heard of it. And so we've got really quite a steep hill to climb here. I think we are climbing it, and I'm seeing actual results month to month. Shows like yours are very, very important in that, irrespective of the size of the audience, if you've got discerning, sophisticated people listening, and if they are people who tend to take a little bit of action, go online and post thoughtful commentaries, maybe mention things on other shows and so forth, that we can begin to spread this documented mass of information showing us a whole different history, a whole different recent history of this country. And so I am hopeful that eventually this will lead to some new investigations on Capitol Hill and elsewhere, and perhaps even in the criminal courts.
We're almost out of time on this side. Very quickly, one of the things you write about, Texas author and journalist Mickey Herskowitz was doing a puff piece biography of George W. Bush prior to W's presidential campaign run, and W disclosed to him that he was contemplating invading Iraq even before he became president. That typifies, I should say, the type of thing that one might expect to shake the tree a little bit and perhaps see a little bit of political fruit drop from the branches.
Well, what's extraordinary about that, Dave, is in all these instances, and by the way, that information I tried to publish in 2004 when I first interviewed Mickey, and I ran up against resistance with all these top news organizations. They were tantalized by the information, but they were terrified of the consequences of being out front of the pack reporting this information. And so this is what we're looking at. And I think that as I talk to big names in media and so forth, they're all kind of, they really are afraid that they're going to get chopped off. And so they're sort of, they just want to see some kind of reassurance. And this is why I'm trying to start doing more of these cable programs and what have you, so that I can create a comfort zone so that all these folks, most of whom are perfectly decent people, can feel the confidence, and the fear will recede, and they'll say, I can go a little further with this material. As you point out, that Mickey Herskowitz stuff, he was is a well-known Texas journalist, and so there's really no question as to his overall credibility. It's just a question whether people will run with it.
Let's explore this further in the second side of this program, because we're almost out of time in side one. This concludes side one of For the Record program number 730, Interview with Russ Baker. This program is being recorded on December 3rd of the year 2010. For Russ Baker, this is Dave Emery saying thanks for listening. Hello, my name's Dave Emery, and this is Side 2 of For the Record program number 730, Interview with Russ Baker. This program is being recorded on December 3rd of the year 2010. Once again, it is my pleasure and privilege to bring back to our airwaves Russ Baker, the author of the consummately important, recently published Family of Secrets. Everything you need to know, but probably didn't know about the Bush family through the generations. Russ, welcome back to our airwaves.
Thank you very much. Just like to mention, Dave, the subtitle on the paperback edition of Family of Secrets, which is The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years.
I'd like to ask you, and maybe this is too subjective a point to really pin down, but in discussing the fear that some of the more mainstream news organizations and people affiliated with them appear to demonstrate with regard to approaching something. For example, we were talking about Mickey Herskowitz, the Texas author and journalist, who learned from George W. Bush that he was thinking about invading Iraq in the late 1990s. When you say fear, do you get the feeling that they're afraid physically, or is it professional retribution? They'll simply lose their job and will then become blacklisted and thereby unable to earn, or is it a little of both?
I mean, I think it's mostly the latter. I think that it's a concern professionally, and people say to me all the time, "Listen, I'd love to do more, but the reality is I have a mortgage and I have kids in college, and I'm no use if I don't have a job. I do what I can." I hear this all the time. I've heard this throughout my career, and they say, "I admire you being an independent journalist, but that's very, very tough, and most of us can't do that." And so, I mean, I think this is true of all these people, plus the fact, of course, that they get all the status that goes with being a well-known, say, television anchor or what have you, and tremendous income. I mean, it's not just that they would be sacrificing a lot to or risking their survival to give it up. It's that they would be giving up a very lavish lifestyle. So there are two sides to that. But in any case, I think that there is a notion that you just can't talk about these things. And we see this. I mean, look at what happened with Bill Maher when he said that he didn't think the correct term to apply to people who would strap bombs on and blow themselves up was coward. And it was basically, that was a matter of semantics. He wasn't endorsing them in any way, but there he was forced off the air. And the Dixie Chicks and on. And so there are real consequences for even that kind of speech, which I think is much less controversial, actually, than reporting out these facts about a living ex-president and the very, very bizarre set of circumstances surrounding his inability to remember where he was on November 22, 1963. That is, you're talking about many, many football fields away from where people comfortably want to reside.
Of course, it is said that everyone who was of the age of consciousness remembers exactly where they were and what they were doing at the time they heard President Kennedy had been shot. Of course, the elder George W. Bush, the gentleman to whom you were referring, was certainly of the age of consciousness, and CIA headquarters is named after him. So the notion that he would not have remembered where he was when he was in the immediate vicinity is simply not credible. You made the reference to Bill Maher, and there was a political comedian who couldn't say that he launched the genre, but Mort Saul, who was a political comedian of considerable, and who, by the way, is still gigging.
Yeah, I saw him not too long ago in New York City.
Yeah, and he was actually one of Jim Garrison's investigators. He was looking into the Kennedy assassination, and in his autobiography, Heartland, he asked the question, how many lies can you allow yourself to believe before you belong to the lie? And as we look at journalistic organizations and many other professional institutions that have a difficult time moving in the direction that they should, simply because of the fact that the bread is buttered on the other side, it raises an interesting question about whether it's too late. Mort Saul then asked, is it too late for America? And I think that's a question that one would certainly wind up asking after reading Family of Secrets. One of the things, too, that I was struck by in reading the book, and that is let me ask you, do you think at this point that an American election should necessarily be seen as a psyop, as a psychological operation?
My research for Family of Secrets showed me that those elections that I looked at all had the earmarks of some degree of covert intervention. And I would say that it was either in elections or it was during the presidency of the person who was elected. That would apply to Obama. That would apply to Clinton. to Carter being denied re-election, to the election of Reagan and H.W. Bush, certainly George W. Bush. And in Family of Secrets, of course, I go into great lengths about what happened to CBS News when they went after Bush on his military service, or I guess I should say non-service, or missing service, and what happened to Kerry with the Swift boat veterans and so on. And, I mean, there's a very fine line between what you would call kind of normal hardball, PR advertising methodologies and actual covert operations. I don't think there actually is any real distinction if these operations involve a kind of inherent dishonesty and a desire to move the public in a direction that it runs counter to their interests and to confuse and deceive them. I think it's all sort of the same thing. In fact, if we go back in the history of advertising and publicity to people like Bernays, we see that they worked very closely with these covert entities in addition to doing the same kind of things for private companies.
Yeah, there's a book called The Science of Coercion by Christopher Simpson. It's called Communications Research and Psychological Warfare, 1945 to 1960. And one of the things he points out is the extent to which communications research as an academic discipline and psychological warfare are inextricably linked and really evolved hand in hand in the post-World War II period. One of the things I've wondered about, have you had any... In your discussion of both the swift boating of John Kerry and also the deep sixing of Dan Rather when he began looking into George W.'s military record, both could conceivably lead to investigations and possibly even the prosecution of some of the apparent malefactors. Have you had any? Has there been any feedback in that regard? Have you had anybody offered to look into either of those?
I have to tell you that the whole investigative apparatus itself is somewhat problematical. The more we learn about the Justice Department and the corporate control of the Justice Department itself, their influence over who becomes Attorney General, that is the most important branch of government, I would say, in this sense of, or I should say department of government, other than the Department of Defense, in the impact that it has on the fortunes of the American oligarchy, because if those people do not deem what is being done illegal or worthy of investigation, then they're home free. And so this is something that has to be neutralized, just as in historically in great American cities, the organized crime immediately wanted to neutralize the police chief, the chief of detectives, the head of the vice squad, and so on. So I don't see how we're ever going to even get these things investigated until we ourselves investigate the entire apparatus, including the investigative agencies themselves.
One of the major news stories of 2010, of course, was the blowout of the Deepwater Horizon rig down in the Gulf and the Gulf of Mexico. And you talk about some of the forces that manifested themselves down there, specifically BP and a powerful Scottish banking family, the Gamels, who were involved with BP, among other things, as well as the Blair administration. We've talked about that. We talked about that in the 6 interviews that we did, but I wonder if you'd review that for us, because with that, with BP so much in the news, I think it's very interesting to contemplate this Scottish banking connection and also petroleum connection to the Bush family.
Yeah, I mean, there were these different strands I followed that ended up coming together when you went back far enough. And, for example, I just was curious about that close relationship and friendship between George W. Bush and Tony Blair, which surprised, I think, everyone, because Blair was labor and he was seen as sort of a liberal and a smart guy and so forth, and he was seemingly very close with Bill Clinton, and then along comes George W. Bush, and they're even closer. So I just wanted to know more about that, and as I went back, I wanted to know, what was the beginning of that relationship, and it turned out that they'd been introduced by this fellow Bill Gamel, Scots, who's in the oil business. And then I found that Gamble knew both of them since he was young, and he went to prep school, so-called public school, with Blair in Scotland, and he went to and they were friends of the Bushes. In fact, George H.W. Bush, when he was supposedly in the oil business, was Zapata offshore, something I show in Family of Secrets appears to have been an intelligence cover. But he would travel to places like Scotland, and they would stay with the Gambles on their sheep farm, and he would bring young George W. along, essentially, I think, teaching him the real family business. And so there they are, mixing with the Gambles. I have a quote in Family of Secrets where one of the employees of the banking firm that the father runs chuckles and says, "We were thought of as the CIA station in Scotland." And then I find the great-grandfather was involved with the post-war occupation, World War II, very close with Averell Harriman, who was a business partner of the grandfather Bush, Prescott. And so all of these relationships go way back. Blair is something different from a different class and so forth, but he shows up in the mix. He's friends with this Gamble fellow, he's friends with Bush, and he says, this guy's okay, you can work with him. And then we start seeing all these other consequences. We see Gamble gets into the oil business. They fund a couple of generations of Bush's enterprises in Texas. They themselves get some help with some of their attempts to lease offshore off of India. And then we see British Petroleum in the picture, and we see how Tony Blair was so favorable to British Petroleum, they practically owned his government, and his own cabinet was just stocked so heavily with BP people. And then other people of his, when they left, they went and joined BP. And so when we then see this disaster off of the Gulf Coast with BP involved, and we see Halliburton also involved, another company that had been in the orbit of Bush companies. We begin to get a sense that all these people know each other. How did they end up getting the contracts, the right to, how did they know to bid on this particular property, that this was going to be so lucrative, how beat out the others? How does all of this work? And I started looking into it, and I saw, we don't look into, let's say, the assigning of drilling rights very well. We don't look into how it is that certain companies know which one to bid on. We don't look into any of these things, frankly.
And it's interesting, too, to observe how the British petroleum situation is inextricably linked with their intelligence community. You point out in Family of Secrets that MI6 and in particular the British Foreign Intelligence Service also has something of a revolving door relationship with the management of BP. By the way, we should call it BP. One of the things that Barack Obama got in trouble with was referring to it as British Petroleum, which it used to be. They've now officially changed their name to BP.
Yeah, that's a good trick, just like Blackwater calling itself XC and still Blackwater. They do that all the time. By the way, that whole British Petroleum thing, you can take that back to the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran, where the British were the principal oil interests there, but the U.S. Went in and helped them out, helped them get the Shah in there. And by the way, one of the key architects of that was a fellow named Kermit Kim Roosevelt, the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, a high CIA officer. And then you see in Family of Secrets, he leaves and he joins, I want to say, I think it was Gulf Petroleum, Gulf Oil. And then when H.W. Bush, who's in the private oil business in the late 50s, and he puts a rig off of Cuba prior to the Bay of Pigs invasion, he's doing that at the behest of Gulf Oil with Mr. Kermit Roosevelt on the board. So I'm sure these are all coincidences, but they're pretty intriguing.
It's interesting, too, that although you don't write about it in Family of Secrets, once again, BP is looming large in the questions that are being asked about the release of the convicted Lockerbie bomber, too, because BP got an offshore oil concession from Libya, and there are questions about the possibility of strings having been pulled there to secure, I think I've forgotten the gentleman's name off the top of my head, but the convicted Lockerbie bomber as well.
There's always a lot more to these stories. By the way, on the BP situation, you have yet more connections. So we were talking about Iran. So George de Mohrenschildt, who we talked about, who was essentially Lee Harvey Oswald's handler, and also, as I go into in one entire chapter in Family of Secrets, turns out to have been an old friend of George H.W. Bush long before the assassination.
And also an old friend of, the Bouviers, but Jackie Kennedy's family.
Right, and then involved in some oil operations with Aristotle Onassis, who would become Mr. Jackie Bouvier. And then I find out that he also was involved with leasing millions of acres of Cuba from Batista for oil exploration. So the way that this stuff spreads out and the way that it all ends up being about control of natural resources, that is a story that we rarely hear that in the day-to-day news.
And throughout, again, hopefully not to belabor the point too much, but throughout Family of Secrets and throughout the generations of the Bushes, a number of themes present themselves. One, corporate power manifesting itself through generations, that corporate power inextricably linked with intelligence matters and covert operations. George W. Bush has been flogging his book, Decision Points, and I caught a sound bite. He was at Facebook's headquarters in Palo Alto a couple of days ago, and he was asked about the bailouts after the Lehman Brothers collapse and the collapse of Wall Street. And he said, well, that was an example of how I had to go against my ideology. My ideology is such that I think that people should be stuck with the consequences of their failures. But in this case, there was too much at stake, so we had to go ahead and bail them out. I thought of you when I heard that, because one of the things, obviously, George W. Bush's, the fact that he has not had his feet held to the fire, his lack of corporate accountability and professional responsibility.
Well, his own companies were all failures, and every one of them was bailed out by friends and financial supporters of the Bush family, or by others who had reasons to want to curry favor with his father as vice president and so forth. You see that all the time. By the way, the ironic thing with Lehman Brothers is that a year they let that one go when they didn't have to, but this is a little-known fact that probably the most profitable part of Lehman Brothers was salvaged and was sold for, I believe it was $1 to a cousin of George W. Bush.
Oh, well, there you go. There you go.
So they didn't do too badly.
Well, the family that maintains their secrets tends to profit thereby. One of the things that you write about, we were talking briefly about Zapata Oil, or Zapata Offshore Petroleum, and how that appears to have been an intelligence front. That's the case with so many different business enterprises that one encounters with both Georges Bush. One of the things that struck me about, one of the things that looms large in my own memory about Family of Secrets, and that is Harken Energy. Harken Energy was basically little more than a money laundering front. I mean, that's basically what it was. It was not so much an energy company as a vehicle for money laundering and apparent covert operations.
It was part of a pattern that I believe is still going on today, where surrogates come in and, using what appears to be funds coming from elsewhere, buy up companies that are either undervalued or have a brand name but are at present something of a shell of what they used to be, and then even force the value of the company down more through certain techniques, including bad-mouthing the company they just bought, and then they buy up all the remaining shares, take the control of the company, and then huge amounts of money of mysterious origin begin pumping in, and then the next thing that happens is there's a web of all of these offshore and associated entities, just like Enron had, that no auditor can figure out, and they start setting up subsidiaries all over the world, and the shareholders are never making a profit, or rarely, and so you have to assume that the continued existence of these entities is for some other purpose than the profit taking of the investing public. By the way, you see that with other companies, and in Family of Secrets, I interview a guy named Bob Gow, who worked for Zapata Offshore, and then later had his own kind of strange globe-girdling company that didn't make any money, and he was an employee of Bush 41, and he was the employer of Bush 43, and he talked proudly about how they went all over the world setting up these accounts so they could move the monies in such a way as to avoid taxes, and because these companies were not profitable, it didn't make any sense to me that they'd even have any incentive to do that. He left it at that, and the rest is for people to speculate as to why.
After the Wall Street collapse, of course, one of the things that has dominated economic news, and that is the exponential increase in the price of gold. Veteran listeners to this program are familiar with the work of Peggy and Sterling Seagrave and their landmark text, Gold Warriors, as well as its preceding and companion volume, Yamato Dynasty. You not only reference Gold Warriors, but one of the things that looms large, again, in Harken Energy, with the Harvard, I've forgotten what the investment arm of Harvard University is formally called, but inextricably linked with the world of covert operations, Harken Energy, the Bush family are basically gold warriors. There's a lot of gold bullion and apparent speculation involved with that tangle as well.
Yeah, this was all new territory to me. In fact, one of the things I always try to make clear is that I was not what you would call a JFK assassination buff. I didn't suspect that there was more to Watergate. I didn't know much of anything about gold. So I went into all of these things simply just asking general questions and following them wherever the trail went, collecting information. The gold story you refer to in Family of Secrets in a chapter called the quacking duck. It walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, and it was about this strange Harken energy. And the more I dug into it, the more it pointed toward gold, and all these roads led back very intriguingly, and you could write a whole separate book on this, to World War II and Douglas MacArthur's intelligence operation, Poppy Bush's role in World War II, and all these different figures, including the man who ends up being the head of the Harvard Board of Overseers, probably the single most powerful person at Harvard University, who directs tens of millions of Harvard's investments into this little unprofitable Harken. He turns out to have served with General MacArthur in the war. The man who buys Harken Energy, a lawyer from New York, his father turns out to have been based in the Philippines all of his life, an American close to Ferdinand Marcos, and before that, General MacArthur.
This is Alan Quasha, right?
Right, and his father, William Quasha. So these are these fascinating things. It all flows back to gold, and then you start seeing Quasha and some of the other guys being put on things like the American Express Gold Fund, other gold funds, and it's hard to know what to make of it, but it certainly looks like something. And when you put that together with the work that the Seagraves and other people have done about the manipulation of gold supplies, one really does come away with the impression that there is some vast cache of gold somewhere that has been around for at least since the end of World War II, and that has been doled out over the years to fund unauthorized covert operations worldwide.
Was it Robert Stone? He was the fellow.
Robert G. Stone.
Robert
That's
G.
right.
Stone,
Yeah.
and himself with many intelligence.
And his brother connected with the Central Intelligence Agency. And then I found Robert Stone involved in a little obscure Texas company with Tom Devine, the CIA officer who was involved with H.W. Bush in setting up Zapata offshore. So all of these, if you were to do one of those those online, they have the muckety website with all the links and stuff. The links here would create quite a dense spider web.
Again, the term networking, not conspiracy theory, but networking, which carries a very different onus to it. In addition to the Gamels and Harken Energy, you go into a number of other things. Well, let me. We got about 5 minutes left here. As we contemplate the economic wreckage in the latter part of the book, you muse about just what exactly we have been left with. Obviously, George W. Bush was not qualified to be president. You explored how somebody like that got to the position he got to, and you also ruminated a bit about what he left behind for all of us. Perhaps in the next couple of minutes, I wonder if you would share some of your thoughts with us about where we are now and looking back on the Family of Secrets and the things they've done. What are some of your thoughts in that regard?
Well, I find myself questioning more and more almost everything that I see in the news, wondering whether we couldn't do a much better job of examining the institutions that are central to our lives and our being. I mean, so many people. I had lunch the other day with an ex-intelligence officer, a good guy, by the way, and there are a lot of good people working in these things, simply only saw what he saw and has no greater understanding of the enterprise of which he was part. And I think we all fail to see the larger enterprise of which we're part. I don't think we see the companies we work for and the implications of what they do and what they stand for. I don't think we fully understand the elections that we take part in. I don't think we give nearly enough thought to the entire economic system in this giant, to me, now I'm no expert in economics, but looks to me to be basically a giant legalized gambling apparatus that wreaks havoc with all of our lives, with our mortgages and our homes and our, our pensions and what have you, that we're in a kind of a crazy dream almost, that really nothing makes any sense. And by the way, I do want to kind of end this on a positive note and say that this may sound like a kind of a paradox, but I enjoy what I do. I love looking into these things. I can tell you do. You seem to be generally, I guess, I don't know you well, a contented person. And looking into these things and trying to come to terms with our individual existences and then how we fit into the larger thing actually is a kind of an ennobling and empowering phenomenon. And it is the first step on the road to getting control of our lives and our world. And I talk to people all the time, and they say, "Well, gee, I'm demoralized. What can I do? I want to." Somebody said to me, "I want to stick my head in the sand like an ostrich." And I say, "Well, you do that, and somebody comes along and kicks your behind." Mm-hmm. So that's not the solution. But just merely the act of wanting to know more about how things work is in itself a ticket to a happier, more fulfilled life. And also, as we become equipped with knowledge, we spread that to others. And certainly you do that, and you play a very important role, Dave, in doing that in your station as well, and the stations that carry this show. But we all have this capability to really transform the world, because almost everything bad and everything good that has happened in the world began with one person. And so I truly believe that anybody, particularly as long as the Internet remains unregulated and we can all get on there for free and do things, we have the capacity to learn and then educate others and to begin this crucial process of taking back this thing, if we ever had it or if we never had it, to take it and to start fashioning it into a kind of world in which we want to live.
One positive thing about the age in which we live, and that is the technology that permits a person to acquire and then in turn communicate information. A lot of people ask me, well, I believe what you're saying, but what can I do about it? There is nothing that people can do about it that would be more effective than A, getting Family of Secrets, reading it, understanding it, and then take little portions of the book. It's 600 pages long. Go on the Internet, communicate little passages. You can go on talk shows and spread the word, but get the word out, because basically if people are going to act effectively, they can only do so when they have the right information. And that is an absolute prerequisite. Tell them about your website, Russ. We're almost out of time.
Sure. The website for the book is familyofsecrets.com. Also, as we said, we have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/Family of Secrets. For Who, What, Why, we have whowhatwhy.com. That's our nonprofit investigative reporting site, where we will continue to dig into the crucial issues of our time from here on forward.
And what was the subtitle of the paperback edition of the book?
The paperback subtitle of Family of Secrets is The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. It's available in bookstores. I always encourage people to go to the Independents. The chains have it as well, and you can get it online from all your favorite sources. It's available also as an e-book.
And For the Record program 711 through 716 are 6 one-hour interviews with Russ Baker about the book. It'll give you a good overview of the material that's in it, and those are permanently archived both on the SpitfireList.com website and on WFMU's website as well. This concludes For the Record program number 730, interview with Russ Baker. This program has been recorded on December 3rd of the year 2010. For Russ Baker, this is Dave Emery saying thanks for listening.